Jacob Whitmore didn't buy a horse that day. He didn't buy cattle, and he didn't buy land. He bought a woman. The transaction happened on a Tuesday morning in September of 1873. The air in the Wyoming Territory was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and gunpowder, and promises that had long since turned to dust. Jacob counted out 50 silver dollars, one by one, into the calloused, waiting palm of Chief Running Bear. Each coin was a cold, heavy circle of sunlight. Each one felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin. Behind the chief stood his daughter. Her name was Singing Wolf. She was maybe 19 years old, with eyes so dark they seemed to pull the light right out of the sky. And in those eyes was a fire, a defiant blaze that made Jacob's chest feel tight, like a rope was being cinched around his ribs. She had the fierce, untamed beauty of a wild Mustang, the kind that would rather die than feel the saddle. This was the girl who had refused to marry the warrior, Stonehawk, a refusal that had spit in the face of tradition, brought shame on her family, and threatened to shatter the fragile peace between two tribes. So she was being sold, like livestock. And Jacob, a 42-year-old veteran with a limp and more scars on his soul than on his skin, was the buyer. "She is strong-willed," Chief Running Bear said, his English careful and heavy, like he was placing each word down like a stone. "Perhaps too strong for our ways." Jacob just nodded, the silver dollars feeling like acid in his pocket. He was a rancher, a man who had carved 800 acres out of the wilderness with his bare hands and a loneliness so deep it was like a second shadow. He hadn't come here looking for a wife. He'd come looking for a simple trade agreement for winter pelts. But the chief had made him another offer, an offer that solved a problem for both of them. The chief saved face, and Jacob got someone to break the suffocating silence of his empty log house. It was just business, a practical arrangement. That's what he told himself as he watched Singing Wolf stand there, her chin held high, looking less like a bride and more like a queen about to be executed. Then Jacob noticed something, a detail that made the hairs on his arm stand up. The chief's hand, the one that had just taken his money, was missing two fingers. The same two fingers that had been missing from a man he'd seen years ago, a man who was supposed to be long dead. A man who had left him for dead in a muddy ditch during the war. The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't a simple transaction. This was something else entirely. He looked at the chief, then at the girl. What had he just walked into? Singing Wolf spoke for the first time, her voice low and sharp, cutting through the tension. "I did not ask for your respect, white man. I asked for my freedom." Jacob felt the rebuke like a slap, but her words were drowned out by the thunder in his own head. The chief, Running Bear, wasn't just some tribal leader. He was Sergeant Running Bear, the man who had betrayed their unit, the man who had stolen military supplies and vanished, leaving Jacob and his men to be slaughtered. And he had just paid that man 50 silver dollars. The girl's eyes were locked on his. She saw the shock on his face, the sudden recognition. She saw something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of fear, or was it something else? Something that looked dangerously like understanding. Jacob shoved the receipt into his vest, his hand trembling slightly. This changed everything. The girl wasn't just a purchase anymore. She was a link to his past, a past he had spent nearly a decade trying to bury. "Then we'll have to figure out how you can earn it," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. He was talking about her freedom, but in his mind, he was talking about his own revenge. Chief Running Bear's eyes narrowed, a silent acknowledgement passing between the two men. He knew that Jacob knew. The air crackled with unspoken threats. The 50 silver dollars weren't a payment. They were a challenge, a dare. "Come on," Jacob grunted, turning toward his wagon. "It's a long ride, and we have a lot to talk about." As Singing Wolf walked towards the wagon, she clutched a small leather pouch at her side. Jacob assumed it held personal trinkets. He was wrong. It held a folded, yellowed piece of paper. A map that led to a silver mine hidden somewhere on his 800 acres. A mine that Stonehawk, the spurned warrior, was willing to kill for. A mine that Chief Running Bear had just sold his daughter to get closer to. Jacob thought he had bought a wife. He had actually just stepped into the middle of a war. The ride to the ranch was a long, suffocating silence. The wagon wheels groaned, the horses snorted, but the two people on the seat might as well have been made of stone. Jacob kept glancing over at Singing Wolf. She sat bolt upright, staring straight ahead at the mountains, her expression unreadable. He could feel the tension coming off her in waves. This wasn't the quiet demeanor of a defeated woman. This was the coiled stillness of a predator. He was a soldier. He knew the look. He'd seen it in the eyes of men right before an ambush. He had to know more. He had to understand what he was dealing with. "Why'd you refuse Stonehawk?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She turned her head slowly, her dark eyes pinning him to the wagon seat. She seemed to be weighing him, measuring his worth, deciding if he was worthy of an answer. "He has 3 wives," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Each one carries the marks of his rage on her skin." Jacob felt a cold knot form in his gut. He'd seen enough brutality in the war to last a lifetime. He'd sworn off it. "Your father knew this?" he pressed. "My father knew," she confirmed. "But Stonehawk's warriors guard the best hunting grounds. An alliance with him means our people don't starve in the winter. My happiness was a small price." There it was again, that cold, calculated logic. She spoke of her own life as if it were a chess piece to be sacrificed. But she hadn't let herself be sacrificed. She had refused. She had chosen this, being sold to a stranger, a white man. Why? It didn't add up. There was a piece missing from the puzzle. "So you chose to fight," he said, a note of admiration in his voice he couldn't hide. "I chose to honor my spirit," she corrected him, "and I chose to protect what is rightfully mine." The last part of that sentence hung in the air between them. What is rightfully mine? She wasn't talking about her spirit. She was talking about something tangible, something real. Jacob's mind raced back to the chief, to the map he was now certain she carried. The silver mine. It wasn't just a tribal asset, it was hers. A family secret. An inheritance, perhaps. And Stonehawk wasn't just trying to marry her. He was trying to steal her birthright. Her father, the man who should have protected her, had instead sold her out. He'd made a deal with Stonehawk, and when she refused to be a part of it, he'd found another way to get what he wanted. He'd used Jacob. He'd put his daughter right in the middle of the land where the silver was buried, thinking the ignorant white rancher would be an easy obstacle to remove later. Jacob looked at the mountains in the distance, the same mountains that marked the border of his property. They didn't look like a refuge anymore. They looked like a target. "What's on this land, Singing Wolf?" he asked, his voice low. "What are they all after?" She didn't answer right away. She just watched him, her eyes searching his face for something. Trust, maybe, or weakness. Finally, she spoke. "The same thing your people are always after," she said. "Something they can dig out of the earth and melt in a fire. Something that makes men kill their brothers and sell their daughters." Silver. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a shared understanding. They were both prisoners in a game they were just beginning to comprehend. He was a pawn used by the chief to put her in place. She was the key, the only one who knew the mine's exact location. And Stonehawk was coming for them both. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and red, Jacob's ranch came into view. A sturdy log house, a few barns, a corral. It was his fortress, his sanctuary. But as he looked at it now, with Singing Wolf beside him, he realized it had just become the battlefield. "This is your home," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. Jacob looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and a strange thought crossed his mind. He corrected her. "Our home," he said, "for now." They pulled up to the house just as the last light of day faded. The place looked the same as it always did, but it felt different. Charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Jacob unhitched the horses, his movements slow and deliberate. Every sense was on high alert. He scanned the tree line, the shadows stretching from the barn. Was someone watching? Had they been followed? Inside, he lit a lantern. The small house was simple, functional. A main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and 2 small bedrooms. It had been his escape from the world. Now the world had followed him home. He showed her the spare room. It was small, with a narrow bed and a single window. "This will be yours, he said. She nodded, placing her small leather bag on the bed. Then she turned to face him, her arms crossed. The negotiations weren't over. "We need to set the terms of this arrangement," she said, her voice formal. "All right," Jacob said, leaning against the doorframe. "I will manage the household. I will cook, clean, and tend to the animals. I know how to mend clothes and treat injuries. In return, I will have this room, food, and your protection." "Protection?" Jacob raised an eyebrow. "From Stone Hawk and from my father. They will not let this go. They will come." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "They'll have to get through me first," Jacob said. And he meant it. It wasn't about her anymore, not entirely. It was about his land, his life. They had made him a part of their war, and he'd be damned if he was going to be a casualty. "There's one more thing," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You will not touch me." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear, a line drawn in the sand. "I will not touch you without your permission," Jacob replied, his voice a low, gravelly promise. "You have my word as a soldier." Something in the way he said it, the mention of his past life, seemed to resonate with her. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The first truce had been called. Over a simple dinner of salted pork and beans, they ate in silence. But it was a working silence. Both of them were thinking, planning. "How much time do we have?" Jacob asked, breaking the quiet. "A week, maybe 2, she answered without looking up from her plate. "Stonehawk is arrogant, but he is not a fool. He will gather his warriors. He will wait for my father to give the signal." "The signal?" "My father believes you are a simple rancher. He thinks in a few weeks he can create a reason to visit. A friendly check-in on his daughter. He will bring his men. Stonehawk will bring his. They will surround this place and take what they want. They will make it look like a tragic accident, a raid by unknown hostiles." The cold, brutal efficiency of the plan made Jacob's blood run cold. They had thought of everything. "They don't know who I am," Jacob said, more to himself than to her. "They don't know what I can do. And they don't know that I know the plan," Singing Wolf added, finally meeting his gaze. A small, grim smile touched her lips. "My father talks too much when he drinks. He celebrated his clever deal with Stonehawk the night before he sold me to you." It was a staggering betrayal, so profound, so absolute that Jacob could barely comprehend it. "Why?" he asked. "Why would he do that to his own daughter?" "The silver sickness," she said simply. "It poisons the heart. He believes the mine will give him the power to unite the tribes to fight the white man. He thinks he is a savior. He is just a greedy old man." After dinner, she unrolled the map on the table. It was old deerskin, the lines drawn in charcoal and berry juice. It showed the layout of his land, the streams, the hills, the rock formations. And in the farthest, most inaccessible corner of his property, there was a small, crudely drawn symbol of a wolf's head. "It's hidden inside a cave, behind a waterfall," she explained, her finger tracing the route. "It can only be reached during the driest months, when the water is low." "And that's now," Jacob finished for her. "Yes." They stood there, two strangers from different worlds, staring at a crude map that was either a death sentence or a key to their survival. "They think we're a rancher and a housekeeper," Jacob said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Let's show them what a soldier and a warrior can do." For the first time since he'd met her, Singing Wolf smiled back. It was a flash of lightning in a dark sky, a promise of the storm to come. The first few days were a blur of activity. Jacob and Singing Wolf moved with a shared, unspoken purpose. They weren't just preparing for a fight, they were fortifying a fortress. Jacob worked on the outer defenses. He dug trenches, set up deadfalls, and created hidden firing positions around the ranch. He used every trick he'd learned in the war, turning his peaceful home into a death trap. He was no longer Jacob Whitmore, the quiet rancher. He was Captain Whitmore, the man who had held off 100 Confederate soldiers for 2 days with only a dozen men. He was methodical, ruthless, and deadly efficient. Singing Wolf worked on the inside. She organized their supplies, rationing their food and water. But she was doing more than that. She was gathering her own arsenal. She disappeared into the hills for hours at a time, returning with roots, berries, and leaves that Jacob didn't recognize. One afternoon, he found her grinding a pile of dark, mottled roots into a fine powder. "What's that?" he asked. "A gift for our guests," she said without looking up. "It slows the heart. A small amount causes confusion and weakness. A little more, and the heart stops sleeping." Jacob looked at the quiet, beautiful woman grinding poison with the same focus she used to knead bread. He had bought a housekeeper. He had gotten a master tactician and a skilled chemist. Chief Running Bear and Stonehawk had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They saw a girl. They should have seen a weapon. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, cleaning their weapons and talking strategy. It was during these quiet moments that the wall between them began to crack. He learned that her name, Singing Wolf, was given to her because as a child she could mimic the call of any wolf, and they would answer her from the hills. She learned that his limp wasn't from a bullet, but from a fall he took while dragging a wounded man to safety under heavy fire. They were two survivors, scarred by different wars, who had found themselves fighting on the same side. A fragile respect began to grow between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was the bond of soldiers who know they might die side by side. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the moon rise, she pulled out a beautifully carved wooden flute. She began to play, and the music that filled the night air was hauntingly beautiful. It spoke of loss and sorrow, and a defiant hope that refused to be extinguished. When she finished, Jacob was silent for a long moment. "You play like you've seen the end of the world," he said softly. "I have," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "The world I was born into is gone. I am just a ghost living in its memory." Then she told him the real story of her mother. The missionary woman had taught her to read and write, yes, but her mother hadn't died from the spotted sickness. She had been the previous guardian of the mine's secret. Stonehawk had wanted the secret from her. When she refused to give it to him, he had beaten her, leaving her broken. She had clung to life for a week before the shame and the pain took her. Singing Wolf had been 10 years old. She had watched it all from a hiding place in the woods. Her fight against Stonehawk wasn't just about refusing a marriage. It was about avenging her mother's murder. Jacob felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't about silver anymore. This was about justice. "He will pay for what he did," Jacob swore, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle beside him. "Yes," Singing Wolf said, her eyes reflecting the cold, distant light of the stars. "He will." The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Jacob was checking the perimeter when he found it. A single black feather tied to his fence post with a strip of red cloth. It was a warrior's marker, a warning. Stonehawk was here. He was watching them. That night the attack came, not with a full frontal assault, but with stealth and fire. An arrow, its tip wrapped in burning pitch, soared through the darkness and thudded into the roof of the barn. Within minutes, the dry wood was ablaze. Jacob and Singing Wolf sprang into action. He grabbed buckets while she untied the frantic horses, leading them out of the burning structure and into the safety of the corral. They worked together, a seamless, efficient team, battling the flames under the pale moonlight. But it was a diversion. As they fought the fire, 3 warriors crept toward the house from the opposite side. They were silent, moving like ghosts through the long grass. Their goal was the map, or the girl, whichever came first. They hadn't counted on Jacob's traps. The first warrior stepped on a covered pit, and a dozen sharpened stakes did their work. He didn't even have time to scream. The second warrior stumbled into a tripwire, and a heavy log swung down from a tree, crushing him instantly. The third warrior stopped, realizing his mistake. He drew his knife and backed away, melting back into the shadows. By the time Jacob and Singing Wolf had put out the fire, the threat was gone. But the message was clear. This was just the beginning. They stood in the yard, breathing heavily, covered in soot and sweat. The barn was heavily damaged, but still standing. The horses were safe. "That was a test," Jacob said, reloading his rifle, "to see how we'd react." "They know we're prepared," Singing Wolf said, her eyes scanning the darkness. "They won't make the same mistake twice. The next time, they'll come in force." They went back inside the house, the smell of smoke clinging to them. The illusion of safety was shattered. The war had begun. Singing Wolf cleaned and bandaged a burn on Jacob's arm. Her touch was gentle, professional, but as her fingers brushed against his skin, he felt a jolt, a spark of something that had nothing to do with the battle outside. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the warm glow of the lantern. He saw the strength in her face, the intelligence in her eyes, the courage that burned brighter than any fire. The arrangement was changing. The lines they had drawn were beginning to blur. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his responsibility. They were partners. But as she finished tying the bandage, her eyes met his, and he saw something else in them, a flicker of fear. "What is it?" he asked. "They failed tonight," she said, her voice low. "Stonehawk will be angry. He will punish the warrior who escaped, and he will come back with a vengeance." She was right. The failed attack would only make their enemy more determined, more ruthless. They had won the first battle, but in doing so, they had just made the coming war infinitely more dangerous. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. It was the unnerving calm before a hurricane. Jacob and Singing Wolf used the time to refine their defenses and plan for the inevitable assault. They knew Stonehawk would not use stealth again. He would come with overwhelming force, confident that he could crush them through sheer numbers. Jacob found himself watching her more and more. He watched the way she moved, with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the deadly skills she possessed. He listened to her stories of the spirits of the land, of the way the trees whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. He was a man of dirt and iron, of facts and figures. She was a woman of wind and spirit, of legends and intuition, and yet somehow they fit together. They were two halves of a single, functional fighting unit. One afternoon, she was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the small room. "You have no family," she stated, not as a question, but as an observation. "None that claim me," Jacob admitted, his voice rough. "My father was a merchant in St. Louis. He wanted me to join the family business. I wanted this." He gestured vaguely to the window, to the wide-open land beyond. "He called me a fool. Maybe he was right." "To be free is never foolish," she said, not looking up from her work. Her simple words struck him with the force of a physical blow. That's what this was all about, for both of them. Freedom, the freedom to choose their own path, to live by their own code, even if it meant living alone. But he wasn't alone anymore. That night, a blizzard swept down from the mountains, a sudden and violent storm that buried the ranch in 3 feet of snow. It came without warning, trapping them in the small log house. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the world outside disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. They were completely isolated. No one could get in, and no one could get out. It was during this forced confinement that the last of the walls between them crumbled. They shared stories, dreams, and fears in the flickering firelight. He told her about the horrors of the war, the friends he'd lost, the gnawing guilt that he had survived when so many others hadn't. She told him about her culture, the ceremonies, the songs, the deep connection her people had to the land he now called his own. He found himself looking at his ranch through her eyes. It wasn't just 800 acres of property anymore. It was a living, breathing entity, a sacred space that he had a responsibility to care for. On the third day of the blizzard, Jacob went out to check on the animals in the half-ruined barn. A heavy, snow-laden beam, weakened by the fire, finally gave way. He heard the crack of the wood and looked up just in time to throw himself out of the way. But he wasn't fast enough. The massive beam came crashing down, glancing off his shoulder and pinning his leg to the frozen ground. The pain was a white-hot explosion. He tried to move, but his leg was trapped, and a wave of blackness threatened to pull him under. He grit his teeth, fighting to stay conscious. The cold was already seeping into him, a lethal, numbing poison. He was going to die here, just a few yards from his own house. Then he heard his name being called, a voice cutting through the roar of the wind. Singing Wolf. She appeared like an apparition out of the swirling snow, a rifle in one hand, a look of fierce determination on her face. She took one look at the situation and went to work. With a strength he wouldn't have thought possible, she used a smaller plank as a lever, straining with all her might to lift the beam. It moved just enough for him to pull his leg free. The pain was blinding, but he managed to crawl out. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. The bone was clearly broken. She practically carried him back to the house, her small frame supporting his much larger one. She kicked the door shut against the raging storm and eased him into a chair by the fire. For the next few hours, she was no longer a warrior. She was a healer. She cut away his pant leg with a deft hand, her face calm and focused. She examined the break, her touch surprisingly gentle. "It is a clean break," she said, "but it must be set." She gave him a piece of leather to bite down on. "This will hurt." He nodded, bracing himself. The pain when she set the bone was worse than any bullet he had ever taken. A raw, guttural scream was torn from his throat, muffled by the leather. And then it was over. She splinted the leg with 2 pieces of firewood and wrapped it tightly. Then she brewed a tea from some of the roots she had gathered. It tasted bitter and earthy, but within minutes a warm, pleasant numbness began to spread through his body, pushing the sharp edges of the pain away. For 3 days the storm raged outside, and for 3 days Singing Wolf cared for him. She fed him, tended the fire, and changed the dressings on his leg. She sat with him through the long nights, sometimes playing her flute softly, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. He was completely helpless, completely at her mercy. She could have left him to die in the barn. She could have taken the map and disappeared after the storm passed. She could have killed him in his sleep and made it look like an accident. She did none of those things. She saved him. On the 3rd night, the pain had subsided to a dull throb. The storm was finally breaking. He looked at her as she sat mending one of his shirts by the firelight, the needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" She paused her work and looked at him, her dark eyes seeming to see right through him. "Because you would do the same for me," she said simply. "How do you know that?" "I have watched you," she said. "I have seen how you care for your animals, how you treat me with respect, even when you thought I was just a woman you bought. Your actions tell me who you are, Jacob Whitmore, not your words." Something inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for years, began to thaw. The wall he had built around his heart, the one that kept everyone out, crumbled into dust. This woman, this incredible, fierce and gentle woman, had seen past his scars, past his gruff exterior, and had seen the man he had once been, the man he had forgotten how to be. "Singing Wolf," he said, her name feeling sacred on his tongue. I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the quiet room, as vulnerable and as real as his broken leg. She set down her mending and looked at him, her expression serious. She searched his face, looking for the truth in his eyes. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she said, her voice soft. "But I need to know, do you see me as your equal? Do you respect my spirit, my choices, as much as you desire my company?" "I do," he said, and he had never meant anything more in his life. "I see you as my partner, my friend. You've made my life more real in the last few weeks than it has been in the last 10 years. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, beautiful smile that lit up the room like a sunrise. She reached out and took his hand. "Then we will face what is coming together," she said, "as partners." But as their hands intertwined, a new cold dread washed over Jacob. The blizzard had been a blessing, a temporary shield. But it was ending. And when the snow cleared, their enemies would know they were trapped. Jacob was crippled. Their fortress now had a critical weakness. Its commander couldn't walk. Stonehawk was coming. And this time, Jacob wouldn't be able to stand and fight. The blizzard ended as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a world of pristine, deadly beauty. The snow was a thick, white blanket that muffled all sound, creating an illusion of peace. But both Jacob and Singing Wolf knew it was a temporary reprieve. The snow that had trapped them had also created a perfect blank canvas. Anyone approaching the ranch would leave a clear trail. They had 2, maybe 3 days before the snow was packed enough for a large party to travel. Their timeline had been drastically shortened, and Jacob was still laid up, his leg a throbbing, useless weight. "I can't fight," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm useless to you." "Your mind is not broken," Singing Wolf countered, her voice firm. "Your eyes are not blind. You will be my commander. I will be your soldier." And so began the most intense preparation of their lives. From his chair by the window, Jacob became the strategist. With Singing Wolf's map and his own knowledge of the terrain, he laid out a detailed defense plan. He knew every rock, every tree, every dip and rise in the land. He was a master of terrain, and he would use it to his advantage. Singing Wolf became his hands and feet. She moved tirelessly, setting up the traps he designed, positioning their limited arsenal, and creating hidden stockpiles of ammunition and supplies at key points around the property. She moved through the deep snow with a speed and silence that was almost supernatural, her body fueled by a fierce, burning determination. They worked as one, their thoughts seemingly connected. He would describe a deadfall, and she would know the exact type of knot to use. She would mention a narrow ravine, and he would instantly see how to turn it into a fatal bottleneck. During a lull, she brought him a bowl of stew. He saw how exhausted she was, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "You need to rest," he said. "There will be time for rest when we are dead," she replied, a grim smile on her face. But as she stood before him, he reached out and gently touched a lock of her hair that had fallen across her face. It was an impulsive gesture, a breach of their original agreement. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement that everything had changed between them. The promise of love that had bloomed in the heart of the storm was now their most potent weapon. It gave them a reason to fight, a reason to survive. On the morning of the third day, she saw them, a long, dark line of figures moving against the white snow. There were at least 20 of them, Stonehawk and his warriors. And with them, leading the party, was Chief Running Bear. The final betrayal was complete. He hadn't just sold his daughter, he had come to oversee her execution and claim his prize. "They're here," she said, her voice calm, her hand already on her rifle. "Get to the first position," Jacob commanded from his chair, his own rifle across his lap. "Don't fire until they reach the creek. Let the land do the work first." She nodded, gave him one last look, a look that said everything that words couldn't, and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the white landscape like a ghost. Jacob watched from the window as the war party advanced. They were moving confidently, arrogantly, spread out in a loose formation. They expected to find a crippled rancher and a lone woman, terrified and ready to surrender. They were walking into a nightmare. The first screams echoed across the valley when the lead warriors fell into a snow-covered trench lined with sharpened stakes. The confident advance faltered. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Then they hit the tripwires. Snares made of thick ropes snatched men by the ankles, hoisting them upside down into the trees, leaving them helpless and exposed. From a rocky outcrop 200 yards away, Singing Wolf opened fire. Her shots were measured, precise. She wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. She was targeting their leaders, sowing chaos, turning their organized force into a panicked mob. Every shot found its mark, a warrior dropping into the snow, clutching a wounded leg or shoulder. From the house, Jacob added his own fire. He was a master marksman, and even from a seated position, his aim was true. He took out the warriors who were trying to rally the others, his heavy buffalo rifle punching through their winter furs with devastating effect. The snow-covered field became a killing ground. Stonehawk and Running Bear, seeing their forces being decimated by an unseen enemy, desperately tried to restore order. They had expected a battle. This was a slaughter. "Fall back, to the trees!" Stonehawk roared, realizing they were completely exposed in the open. The remaining warriors scrambled for the cover of the woods. But Jacob and Singing Wolf had anticipated this. The woods were no safer than the field. Singing Wolf had spent a day rigging deadfalls and hidden pits throughout the trees. The retreat was just as costly as the advance. More screams echoed from the woods as Stonehawk's men fell victim to the traps. In less than an hour, a force of 20 warriors had been reduced to less than half that number. But Stonehawk was a seasoned fighter. He was not so easily defeated. He and the remaining warriors, including Running Bear, took cover behind a thick stand of aspen trees, regrouping and planning their next move. They knew where the shots were coming from now, the house and the rocky outcrop. They were pinned down, but they had superior numbers. They decided on a two-pronged assault. Stonehawk would lead a charge on the house, while Running Bear and a few others would circle around and flank Singing Wolf's position. Jacob saw them splitting up. "They're trying to flank you," he said, speaking to the empty room, knowing she couldn't hear him. "Get back to the house, now." But she was too far away. He watched in horror as Running Bear and three warriors began to move stealthily through the trees, closing in on her position. He was helpless. He couldn't move from his chair. He could only watch as the woman he loved was about to be caught in a trap. He laid down a furious barrage of covering fire, trying to slow Stonehawk's advance on the house. But his heart was up on that rocky hill. He saw a flicker of movement near Singing Wolf's position, her own father leading the men who were coming to kill her. Then Singing Wolf did something unexpected. She stood up. She stepped out from behind the rocks, holding her rifle, and stood in plain view. It was an act of supreme defiance, a challenge. Running Bear and his men stopped, stunned by her bravery. She raised the rifle, but she didn't point it at them. She pointed it at a spot high up on the mountain above them, a huge overhanging cornice of snow, weakened by the sun. Jacob understood instantly. An avalanche. He watched, his heart in his throat as she fired. The crack of the rifle was followed by a deep, rumbling groan. The entire face of the mountain seemed to shift. A white wave of snow, ice, and rock broke loose and began to thunder down the slope, directly toward the trees where Running Bear and his men were standing. There was no time to run. They looked up, their faces masks of terror, as the white death roared down upon them. Singing Wolf didn't wait to watch. The moment she fired, she was running, leaping from rock to rock, heading back toward the house. The avalanche was a terrifying spectacle of nature's power. It obliterated the aspen grove, burying Running Bear and his men under tons of snow. The ground shook as if from an earthquake. Stonehawk and his men, who had been charging the house, stopped dead in their tracks, staring in disbelief at the destruction. Their flanking maneuver had been wiped out. Their chief was gone. Their confidence was shattered. In that moment of hesitation, Singing Wolf reached the back of the house and slipped inside. She was breathing hard, her face flushed with adrenaline, but her eyes were bright and clear. "The flank is gone," she said, taking up a position at the other window. "I saw," Jacob said, his voice filled with awe. "My God, Singing Wolf, I saw." Now it was just them against Stonehawk and the handful of warriors who remained. The battle wasn't over. The most dangerous part was about to begin. Stonehawk was no longer fighting for silver. He was fighting with the rage of a humiliated man, and he was coming for them. The silence that followed the avalanche was more terrifying than the noise. Stonehawk and his remaining 5 warriors were hidden in the trees, licking their wounds, their arrogance replaced by a grim, desperate fury. They had lost more than half their men. Their chief was buried under a mountain of snow, and their simple plan was in tatters. But they weren't broken. "They'll wait for nightfall," Jacob said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "They'll try to use the darkness to get close." "Let them," Singing Wolf said, calmly reloading her rifle. "The darkness is my friend too." As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the blood-stained snow, a strange sense of peace settled in the small house. The frantic energy of the battle was replaced by a quiet resolve. They knew the final confrontation was coming. They knew they might not survive it. They shared a piece of dry jerky and a canteen of water, their last meal together perhaps. "Jacob," Singing Wolf said, her voice soft in the growing twilight, "if we do not see the sunrise—" "We will," he interrupted, his voice fierce. "We will see the sunrise." He reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was strong. In that touch, they found a strength that rifles and traps could never provide. They were fighting for more than land, more than silver. They were fighting for a future they had only just begun to imagine. As darkness fell, the attack came. It was exactly as Jacob had predicted. Silent, swift. They came from 3 directions at once. moving like wraiths through the shadows, their knives glinting in the faint starlight. But Jacob and Singing Wolf were ready. They had spent the last hour rigging their final defenses. Jacob had instructed her to pour lamp oil on the ground in a wide circle around the house. "Now!" he yelled. Singing Wolf threw a lit match out the window. The oil ignited with a whoosh, and a ring of fire erupted around the cabin, bathing the entire yard in a flickering, hellish light. The advancing warriors were caught in the open, their shadows dancing grotesquely. The house became a fortress of death. From the windows on either side, Jacob and Singing Wolf fired with deadly accuracy. The warriors had nowhere to hide. Two fell in the first volley. A third tried to run back to the trees and was cut down before he took 5 steps. Only Stonehawk and one other warrior remained. They were pinned down behind the water trough, the firelight making them easy targets. "It's over, Stonehawk!" Jacob yelled. "Surrender!" Stonehawk's answer was a roar of pure rage. He stood up, firing his rifle wildly at the house. He was no longer a tactician. He was a cornered animal, lashing out in his final moments. Jacob's return shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The last warrior saw his chance. While Stonehawk drew their fire, he made a desperate dash for the side of the house, hoping to find cover in a blind spot beneath the window. He was fast. He made it to the wall. He pressed his back against the logs, gasping for breath just below the window where Singing Wolf was positioned. Jacob couldn't see him. He was focused on Stonehawk. "He's at your window," Jacob screamed. "Singing Wolf, he's right below you." She spun around, but it was too late. The warrior was already climbing up, his knife clenched between his teeth. His face appeared in the window, twisted in a mask of hate. He lunged inside. Singing Wolf fired her rifle from her hip, but the warrior was too close. The bullet tore through his side, but his momentum carried him forward. He crashed into her, and they both went down, his knife skittering across the floor. Jacob watched, helpless, from his chair across the room. He tried to raise his rifle, but he couldn't get a clear shot. They were a tangled mess of thrashing limbs on the floor. He saw the warrior's hand close around the knife. He saw him raise it high, ready to plunge it into Singing Wolf's heart. With a roar of adrenaline-fueled desperation, Jacob shoved himself out of his chair. He ignored the searing, blinding pain in his leg. He put all his weight on his good leg and lunged forward, using his heavy rifle like a club. He brought the stock down on the back of the warrior's head with all the force he could muster. There was a sickening crack, and the warrior went limp, collapsing on top of Singing Wolf. She pushed the body off her and scrambled to her feet, gasping for air. At the same time, Jacob collapsed, his broken leg giving way completely. The pain was so intense, it made him black out for a second. When his vision cleared, he saw Stonehawk standing in the doorway. He was bleeding heavily from his shoulder, his face pale, but his eyes burned with a triumphant fire. He had used the distraction to make his final move. Jacob's rifle was on the other side of the room. Singing Wolf's was pinned under the dead warrior. They were defenseless. "Now!" Stonehawk hissed, raising his pistol and pointing it at Jacob's head. "It ends." He smiled, a cruel, vicious thing. "First him, then I will take you, and I will take the silver. And you will wish I had killed you too." Singing Wolf stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then her hand moved to her belt, to the beautifully carved wooden flute that she always carried. Stonehawk laughed. "Are you going to play me a death song?" She didn't answer. She raised the flute to her lips, but she didn't play. With a flick of her wrist, the end of the flute came off, revealing a long, needle-sharp steel blade concealed inside. A blowgun dart, coated in the same poison she had shown Jacob days before. Before Stonehawk could react, she put the flute to her lips and blew. The tiny dart flew across the room, almost invisible in the firelight. It struck Stonehawk in the neck. He blinked, a look of confusion on his face. He reached up and plucked the small dart from his skin. He looked at it, then back at Singing Wolf. He opened his mouth to laugh again, but the sound that came out was a choked gasp. His eyes went wide. His hand went to his chest. The pistol fell from his grasp, clattering on the floorboards. He took one stumbling step forward, then another. A look of pure terror replaced the triumph on his face as the poison seized his heart. He crashed to the floor, dead before he hit the ground. Silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire outside and their own ragged breathing. It was over. They had survived. Singing Wolf rushed to Jacob's side. He was conscious, but his face was slick with sweat, his jaw clenched against the agony in his leg. "You stood up," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. "You stood up for me." "Always," he grunted, managing a weak smile. She looked around the room, at the bodies of their enemies, at the man she loved lying wounded on the floor. They had won. They had faced down an army and emerged victorious. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft pink glow over the snow, they heard a sound. Horses. A lot of them. They looked at each other, their brief moment of victory turning to ice in their veins. Who was it? More of Stonehawk's men? Had the whole thing been a trap? A group of riders appeared, cresting the hill. They were native warriors, but they weren't painted for war. They were leading a procession, and at their head was a man Jacob didn't recognize. He was old with a wise, weathered face, and he carried himself with an air of quiet authority. He rode into the yard, his eyes taking in the scene of carnage with a grim expression. He dismounted and walked to the doorway, stopping to look at the body of Stonehawk. "He chose the path of violence," the old man said, his voice deep and resonant, "and he found its end." He stepped into the house and looked at Jacob and Singing Wolf. His gaze was piercing, but not unkind. "I am Black Kettle," he said, "the true chief of Singing Wolf's people. Running Bear was a usurper who seized power while I was away. I heard of his plan, of his deal with Stonehawk. I came as fast as I could, but it seems you have handled the situation." He looked at Singing Wolf, and his expression softened. "My child, your mother would be proud of the warrior you have become." Singing Wolf stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. You knew?" "She was my sister," Black Kettle said gently. "The secret of the mine was her burden to protect. Now it is yours, and it appears you have found a worthy guardian to share it with." He looked at Jacob, then at his shattered leg. "You fought with honor, Jacob Whitmore. You have earned the respect of our people. We will help you rebuild. This land, which was once a source of conflict, can now be a bridge between our worlds." And so the war ended, and a new life began. Black Kettle's warriors helped them bury the dead and begin repairs on the ranch. A healer from their village tended to Jacob's leg, his knowledge of bone setting far superior to theirs. In the weeks that followed, the ranch became a meeting place, a neutral ground where the old resentments between white settlers and the native people began to slowly, cautiously, be replaced by a newfound respect. The silver from the mine, used wisely by Singing Wolf and Black Kettle, helped her people through the harsh winter and establish fair trade with the nearby town. Jacob and Singing Wolf, forged in the crucible of violence and fear, built a life together based on love, trust, and a deep, abiding respect for each other's worlds. The ranch that had been a lonely refuge became a vibrant, thriving home, a symbol of a new kind of future. The veteran rancher who thought he was buying a housekeeper had found a queen, and the native girl who had refused to be a warrior's prize had found a partner who valued her spirit above all else. They had faced the worst of humanity and had chosen to build something better in its wake. Their story became a legend in that corner of Wyoming, a story of how two people from different worlds, pushed together by greed and betrayal, found not only survival but a love that was strong enough to build a new world from the ashes of the old. If you enjoyed this story of courage, survival, and the fight for freedom, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next tale we have in store. And let me know in the comments below, what do you think was the most critical moment that turned the tide of the battle? Until next time, stay safe out there.